My name is Simone Hartwell. I'm 32 years old, and on a Thursday morning in October of 2023, a news van from Channel 7 in Cincinnati pulled into my parents' driveway on Birchwood Lane in a suburb called Fenwick, Ohio, and my father opened the front door in his bathrobe and found two journalists and a camera operator standing on the porch. He had pressure washed every spring for 22 years. I was not there. I was 400 miles away in my apartment in Brooklyn, sitting at my desk with my coffee going cold beside me, watching a live stream on my laptop with the specific, complicated feeling of someone witnessing the precise moment a 20-year narrative gets corrected by reality. My phone was buzzing continuously on the desk beside the laptop. I didn't answer it. I watched the stream. My mother appeared behind my father in the doorway approximately 40 seconds after he opened it. She was dressed, which told you something about the difference between them. My mother has been dressed by 7:30 every morning of her adult life, because appearance is her primary language and she speaks it fluently even in crisis. She looked at the camera. She looked at the journalist, a woman named Andrea Chu, who had been covering arts and culture for Channel 7 for 11 years and who had, 3 days earlier, written the story that started all of this. And my mother's face did something I had never seen it do in 32 years of being her daughter. It lost its certainty. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because the beginning is where the shape of everything lives. You cannot understand a news van in a driveway in October of 2023 without understanding a dining room table in Fenwick, Ohio in the early 2000s and the specific and systematic way a family can tell a child who she is until the child believes it, and then discover, too late, in the most public possible way, that they were describing their own fears rather than their daughter's reality. If this is already finding something in you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if it genuinely resonates. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you are when these words reach you. For as long as I can remember, I was the wrong kind of daughter for the family I was born into. Not wrong in the dramatic sense, not rebellious or destructive or obviously troubled. Wrong in the quieter, more persistent sense of a person whose nature simply did not match the template her parents had prepared. My father, Robert Hartwell, was a procurement manager at a mid-size manufacturing company called Fenwick Industrial, a steady and unimaginative job that he had held for 26 years and that he described, when asked at dinner parties, as keeping the machine running. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had decided early that safety was the highest value and had organized every subsequent decision around protecting it. His own safety, the family's safety, the safety of the narrative he had constructed about what the Hartwells were and what they produced. My mother, Patricia Hartwell, was a former dental practice administrator who had taken a step back from full-time work when I was 8 to manage the household with the focused efficiency she applied to everything. Patricia was the kind of woman who color-coded the family calendar and kept a spreadsheet of holiday gift budgets and whose house was always, without exception, clean enough to receive visitors on no notice. She was also the kind of woman who had very specific ideas about what a daughter should be, and those ideas were organized around a small and clearly defined set of attributes: presentable, practical, socially adept, appropriately ambitious in directions that were recognizable and respectable, and above all, predictable. She wanted a daughter whose life she could explain at the school fundraiser and the church social and the neighborhood barbecue without having to pause and search for language. I was not that daughter. I was the daughter who spent her after-school hours in the garage that my parents had half-heartedly converted into a storage space, where I had set up, by the age of 11, a makeshift studio consisting of a second-hand easel, 3 wooden boards balanced on sawhorses as a work table, and approximately $40 worth of acrylic paints that I had bought with birthday money and the proceeds of a summer's worth of mowing the neighbors' lawns. I painted constantly, obsessively, in the way that children who have found their thing pursue it, without self-consciousness, without concern for outcome, with the total absorption of someone who has located the frequency their brain operates best on. I painted after school and on weekends and during school vacations, and occasionally when I was supposed to be doing homework, in the blue hour after dinner before my parents noticed I'd disappeared from the living room. My father's response to this was not hostile. It was, perhaps worse, dismissive in the comfortable way of a man who has already categorized something as harmless and therefore not requiring engagement. He called my painting your little hobby from approximately the age of 11 until I left for college, which is a span of 7 years during which the thing that was most alive in me was consistently referred to in the diminutive. My little hobby, not unkindly, just small, contained, not a thing to be taken seriously, accommodated, or invested in. A thing to be tolerated the way you tolerate a child's phase of wanting to be a veterinarian, with benign patience, waiting for it to resolve into something practical. My mother's response was more active and more pointed. Patricia understood, earlier than my father, that my commitment to painting was not a phase, and she responded to that understanding with the specific alarm of a woman watching a daughter move away from the template she had prepared. She said things, regularly, consistently, over years, that I have needed significant amounts of therapy to properly process, and that I want to tell you now because I think the specific language of dismissal matters. She said, "Art doesn't pay bills," from the time I was 12. She said, "Artists are a dime a dozen, Simone, and most of them end up miserable," when I was 14 and told her about a teacher who had submitted my work to a regional student art competition without asking me first. She said, "You have a good brain. Why would you waste it?" when I was 16 and said I wanted to study fine arts at university. She said, at the family Christmas dinner of 2008, when I was 17 and had just received my first formal recognition, a second-place award in a statewide high school visual arts competition, which came with a $500 prize and a letter of congratulation from the Ohio Arts Council. She said, in front of my father and my grandmother and my aunt and uncle, "Second place in a high school art show is nice, Simone, but let's not let it go to her head. It's not the real world." I was 17. I folded the letter from the Ohio Arts Council back into its envelope. I put it in my room. I went back to the garage and I painted for 2 hours, and I did not cry because I had learned, by 17, that crying in response to my mother's assessments was both pointless and costly. The worst of it, the sentence I want to tell you about specifically because it is the sentence that gives this story its shape, came in the spring of 2009. I was 18, finishing senior year, and I had applied to the Rhode Island School of Design without telling my parents. I had also applied, as my parents believed, to the University of Cincinnati's Business School and Ohio State's Communications program, safe, respectable, explicable at church socials. But I had applied to RISD with the specific private determination of someone who knows what she is and is done pretending otherwise. I got in. Full portfolio review, conditional merit scholarship, acceptance to the BFA program in painting. I came home from school on a Tuesday in April of 2009 with the acceptance email printed on paper. I had printed it in the school library because I wanted to hold it, needed the physical reality of it, and I put it on the kitchen table where my mother was sorting mail. She read it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she called my father into the kitchen and he read it. And then my father looked at me across the kitchen table and said, with the flat, certain voice of a man delivering a verdict he believes is both final and correct, "We're ashamed to call you our daughter if this is what you're going to do with your life." My mother said nothing. Her silence was its own sentence. I was 18 years old, and my father had just told me he was ashamed of me for getting into one of the most prestigious art schools in the country, and my mother had agreed with her silence. And I was standing in the kitchen of the house where I had grown up with the acceptance letter on the table between us. I picked up the letter. I went to my room. And I made the same decision that I suspect many of you have made in similar kitchens. I decided I was going anyway. Let me give you the infrastructure of what was wrong in the Hartwell household, because infrastructure is the right word for it. Not dramatic cruelty, not obvious abuse, but a load-bearing system of assumptions and standards and selective investments that shaped everything built on top of it. My older brother Daniel was 22 in 2009, 4 years ahead of me, and he was the template made flesh. Daniel had gone to the University of Cincinnati on a partial academic scholarship, studied business administration, graduated in 2008, and taken a position at a financial services firm in Columbus that my father described to every acquaintance who would listen as a real career at a real company with a real future. Daniel was steady and practical and socially conventional in all the ways my parents valued, and they loved him with the uncomplicated, unguarded love of parents whose child has confirmed every expectation they held. I loved Daniel too. He was not cruel to me. He was simply the other data point in the family's internal graph, the one that made my trajectory look like deviation rather than difference. The financial accounting was specific and worth examining. When Daniel started at Cincinnati in 2004, my parents contributed $12,000 annually toward his tuition and living costs, a figure my father mentioned with the satisfaction of a man who had planned well and was seeing the plan execute correctly. When I raised the question of college funding in the fall of 2008, sitting at the kitchen table with a brochure from RISD that I had not yet revealed was my primary interest, my father said that art school was an investment in nothing, and that if I chose a practical degree at a practical school, he would contribute the same he had contributed to Daniel. He said it as a conditional. The contribution was attached to the choice he approved of. He was not hiding the condition. He considered it reasonable. I had done the math. RISD's tuition in 2009 was $36,700 annually, not including room and board. With the merit scholarship I had received, which reduced it to $28,400 per year, and with the maximum federal student loans available to an undergraduate, I would need approximately $14,000 per year in additional funding. I had $6,200 in savings from 4 years of lawn mowing and babysitting and a part-time job at the Fenwick Public Library. I had done the math at the library desk on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and I had understood, clearly and without drama, that I was going to need either my parents' help or a miracle. I got neither, initially. What I got instead was a gap year working 2 jobs in Fenwick, cashier at a craft supply store called Artworks on Mill Street, which was its own small irony, and evening shifts at a diner called the Blue Plate on Route 9. During which I saved $11,400 and applied for every supplemental scholarship and grant I could locate. I deferred my RISD enrollment for 1 year. I told my parents I was figuring things out. They interpreted this as evidence that I was coming to my senses. I was not coming to my senses. I was building a financial runway. The gap year had its own illuminations beyond the financial. Living at home at 18 and 19, working full-time, watching the family operate without the buffer of school schedules and teenage social lives to diffuse the dynamics. It showed me things about my parents' marriage and my parents' values that I had been too young and too inside to see clearly before. I saw that my father organized his pride around other people's recognition of his family in specific and narrow ways: the job titles, the practical degrees, the predictable trajectories. I saw that my mother's investment in appearance extended to her children's lives as social performance, and that my deviation from the template was experienced by her not merely as disappointment, but as a kind of public embarrassment, as though my choices were a reflection on her curation. I saw this most clearly at a neighborhood barbecue in July of 2009, 3 months after the kitchen table conversation, when Patricia was asked by a neighbor named Carol Briggs what her daughter was planning to do after high school. My mother said, "She's taking a gap year, figuring things out." She said it with a practiced lightness that covered something harder, and she moved the conversation on before Carol could ask more. She did not mention RISD. She did not mention the acceptance. She did not mention the merit scholarship or the Ohio Arts Council letter or the statewide competition. I was standing 6 feet away at the snack table, and I heard every word, and I understood. I was not just a disappointment to my parents. I was something they had decided not to mention. I was the daughter they were ashamed to call their daughter. The pattern had smaller textures beyond the large ones. My art supplies were never a Christmas or birthday gift from my parents. Practical things were: a new backpack, a gift card to a clothing store, a sensible item from a list they maintained. The art supplies came from my own money, from my grandmother Vivian on my mother's side, who quietly understood something about me that her daughter had decided not to accommodate, and from a teacher named Mr. Gerald Foss, who was the art department at Fenwick High School, and who gave me, at the end of junior year, a set of professional-grade oil paints that he said had been sitting unused in the supply closet and that I should have. They had not been sitting in the supply closet. He had bought them. I knew this and said nothing and used them for 2 years and thought about Gerald Foss every time I opened the tin. The subject of RISD became, in our household, a word that functioned like weather, something everyone was aware of and that shaped behavior without being directly addressed. My father did not discuss it after the kitchen table conversation. My mother occasionally referenced Simone's plan in the tone of someone describing a stubborn stain they had decided to work around. Daniel, when he came home for holidays, would ask me how the art thing was going in the well-meaning but slightly distancing way of someone who has been told, indirectly, which side of a line to stand on. The money situation in the gap year produced the sharpest moment of clarity I had about my parents' values. In November of 2009, Daniel called from Columbus and mentioned that he needed to replace his laptop for work and that he'd mentioned this to my parents. My father drove to Columbus the following weekend with a check for $1,400 to help with the purchase. I know this because my mother mentioned it at dinner on the Sunday he returned, in the casual way she mentioned things she hadn't fully thought through the implications of. I was at the same table. I had been working 60-hour weeks for 5 months and counting every dollar in a savings account. I said nothing. I did the arithmetic in my head and let it settle into the long record I was keeping of the Hartwell family's investment portfolio, which I was not in. I enrolled at RISD in September of 2010. I had $11,400 in savings, a merit scholarship, maximum federal loans totaling $5,500 for the first year, and 2 additional grants I had found and applied for myself. The Rhode Island State Council on the Art Student Grant at $3,000 and a private foundation scholarship for female artists from the Midwest at $2,500. Total funding gap in year 1, $5,900, which I covered with a part-time job in RISD's facilities department that paid $12 an hour and that I worked 15 hours a week alongside a full BFA course load. My parents contributed nothing. My father said at the dinner the night before my mother drove me to Providence. She drove me, which I have thought about many times since, the fact that she showed up for the departure even while withholding support for the destination. My father said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." He said it without warmth or coldness, in the flat register of a man completing a required sentence. I said, "I will." I meant it in a way he probably didn't fully understand. My mother hugged me in the RISD parking lot the next afternoon. She held on for longer than I expected, and when she stepped back, her eyes were wet, which surprised me. She said, "Be careful." I said, "I will." She said, "Call me." I said I would. She got in the car and she drove back to Fenwick, and I stood in the parking lot of a school my parents were ashamed of me for attending, and I looked up at the building in front of me and I thought, this is where I start. The 4 years I spent at RISD between 2010 and 2014 were the years in which I became a real artist, and I want to be specific about what I mean by real. I don't mean technically accomplished. I had been technically capable since my early teens, since the garage with the second-hand easel and the $40 of acrylics. I mean real in the sense of someone who has found the specific intersection of her vision and her craft and her voice and knows, with the conviction that comes from sustained and rigorous practice, that the intersection is permanent and productive and worth organizing a life around. RISD was not easy. I want to say that clearly because I think stories about people who found their calling sometimes flatten the difficulty into a montage of inspiring moments, and the flattening is dishonest and unhelpful to anyone currently in the middle of the hard part. RISD was intellectually demanding in a way I had not fully anticipated, not just the technical instruction, which was rigorous and exacting, but the conceptual framework, the requirement to articulate what you were making and why and what it was in conversation with and what it was trying to do in the world. I had been painting since I was 11 without having to explain myself to anyone, and being required to explain myself turned out to be the most valuable and most uncomfortable education I received. I was also poor in the specific and unglamorous way of a student working 15 hours a week in facilities management while carrying a full studio load. I ate a lot of peanut butter. I wore the same 4 outfits for semesters at a stretch. I had a cell phone plan that charged me by the minute until my junior year when I found a cheaper provider. I did not go home for spring break in 2011 or 2012 because the bus ticket cost $94 and I had rent due. My parents knew I was not coming home and did not offer to cover the ticket, which I noted and filed away in the long record and kept moving. I called my mother every 2 weeks. The calls were careful and surface level. I reported the practical information of my life. She reported the practical information of hers, and we stayed on the side of the surface where things were fine. She asked about my coursework in the polite, slightly distant way of someone asking about a subject they don't speak the language of. She never asked to see my work. I never offered to show her. We maintained a functional relationship by mutual agreement not to press on the places where it wasn't functional, and this arrangement sustained us through 4 years at a cost I didn't fully assess until later. My father and I spoke less frequently, once a month, sometimes less. The calls were shorter, 5, 8 minutes. The exchange of the minimum required information to maintain the category of relationship without filling it with actual content. He asked about my plans occasionally, which I understood to mean, when are you going to do something practical with this? And I answered with the surface information about the program and my coursework and deflected the underneath of the question with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been deflecting it for years. The relationship that changed my understanding of what my parents' shame had cost me happened in my junior year in the fall of 2012. Her name was Dr. Catherine Marsh, no relation to the Deborah Marsh in A Different Story, and she was a visiting critic from the art world, a curator who had worked at MoMA and was spending a semester at RISD conducting studio visits and seminars. She came to my studio in November of 2012 for a scheduled critique and spent 45 minutes looking at my work in the specific, unhurried way of someone who was actually seeing it. At the end of the 45 minutes, she said, "Who taught you to use color this way?" I said, "Mostly myself. I had a good high school teacher for 2 years." She said, "You should know that what you're doing here is not student work. It's work." She said it with the precision of someone making a distinction that mattered professionally, and I understood what she meant, that the line between student practice and actual artistic contribution had been crossed in my studio without my fully marking the moment of crossing. She asked if she could photograph several pieces for her personal archive. I said yes. She said she would be in touch. I graduated from RISD in May of 2014 with a BFA in painting, a graduate exhibition that received a review in the Providence Journal that called my work startlingly mature and conceptually rigorous, and $43,000 in federal student loan debt. My mother came to the graduation. My father did not, for reasons that were given as a work commitment and that I understood as something more complicated and less honorable than that. My grandmother Vivian came, at 81, having taken a bus from Fenwick to Providence that I had not known she was planning to take until she called me from the Providence bus station to ask if I could pick her up. She was wearing her good coat and carrying a card that contained a check for $300 and a note in her handwriting that said, "I always knew. Love, Gran." I held her at the bus station for a long time. My mother watched my graduation walk and cried again. The same quiet, surprising tears as the RISD parking lot in 2010. I received my diploma, and I looked out at the audience, and I found her face and she was crying, and I understood that my mother contained something real beneath the template management and the shame and the church social performance, and that whatever that real thing was, it was in conflict with the person she had decided to be, and that the conflict was hers to resolve, not mine to solve. I moved to Brooklyn in June of 2014. Catherine Marsh, the visiting critic from my junior year, had kept her word about being in touch. She had connected me with a gallery in Williamsburg called Harrow Gallery that was representing emerging painters, and the gallery director, a man named Felix Osei, who had been doing this for 16 years and had a reputation for finding painters before the market did, had seen photographs of my work and asked to meet. The meeting became a studio visit. The studio visit became a representation agreement signed in August of 2014. I was 23 years old and I had gallery representation before I had a full-size bed. The years between 2014 and 2020 were years of building. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the steady accumulation of someone who was doing the work consistently and whose work was finding its audience incrementally. I had my first solo show at Harrow in 2016. It received a review in Art Forum that described my canvases as color fields with the emotional density of portraiture and called me a painter to watch. 4 pieces sold. Total sales from that show, $28,400. I paid off $11,000 in student loans with the proceeds and kept the rest in savings and went back to the studio. I had a second solo show in 2018, 12 pieces, 8 sold. Total sales, $74,000. I paid off the remaining $32,000 in student loans with a portion of this, bought a better bed, and hired an accountant. I called my mother to tell her about the show. She said, "That's good, Simone," in the voice that was genuinely pleased but still slightly puzzled, as if success in this direction was information she hadn't fully updated her model to accommodate. I did not tell my father about the show. He found out through Daniel, who had seen something on social media, and he called me the week after the show opened and said, in the flat, careful voice of a man navigating unfamiliar territory, "Daniel says your show is doing well." I said, "It is." He said, "Good." That was the whole call. 4 sentences. I put the phone down and I sat in my Brooklyn studio and I thought about a kitchen table in 2009 and the word ashamed, and I thought, 4 sentences. The breaking point came in March of 2021. Not a single event, a convergence of several things in close proximity that produced, together, the specific weight that finally exceeds what any person can carry without putting it down. The first thing, I had been selected in January of 2021 as one of 5 artists to receive the Whitmore Prize, a biennial award given by a private foundation in New York to mid-career painters whose work demonstrated sustained artistic merit and cultural contribution. The prize came with $50,000 and a residency at the foundation's facility in upstate New York, and most significantly in terms of this story, a profile in the New York Times art section that ran on March 8, 2021. The profile was written by a journalist named Andrea Chu. Yes, the same Andrea Chu who would later stand on my parents' porch in October of 2023, who at that time was contributing to the Times on a freelance basis before taking the staff position at Channel 7. The profile was 1,400 words. It included a photograph of me in my Brooklyn studio. It described my trajectory from a small Ohio suburb to gallery representation to the Whitmore Prize with the specific, well-researched detail of a journalist who had done her homework. The profile mentioned my parents, not by name, not in a damaging way. It mentioned, briefly, in the context of discussing my background, that I had pursued my art education without family support and had funded my RISD degree independently through scholarships, grants, and work. 3 sentences. Accurate, precise, sourced from the interview I had given Andrea 3 weeks earlier. My father read the profile. My mother read the profile. They called me on the same day, separately, within 2 hours of each other. My father called first. He said, "There are things in that article that are not accurate." I said, "What specifically?" He said, "It says we didn't support you." I said, "You didn't support me financially, and you told me you were ashamed of my choice." He said, That's not the whole picture." I said, "I told the journalist what happened. It's the accurate picture." He said, "People will read that and think." I said, "Dennis." I used his first name, which I had not done before, and it stopped him. I said, "What they will think is what happened. I'm sorry that's uncomfortable. It's still what happened." My mother called 2 hours later. She was crying, which was the third time in my life I had heard her cry, and the first time it felt like something other than a response to me leaving. She said, "Simone, people from church have seen that article. Carol Briggs called me this morning." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Mom, I understand that's uncomfortable." She said, "Did you have to?" I said, "I told the truth. I've been telling the truth my whole life in my work, and this was just telling it in words." She said, "We love you." I said, "I know you do, in the way you know how. But loving me and supporting what I am aren't the same thing, and you've done one and not the other for a long time, and that's in the record now." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "I don't know what to say." I said, "I know, that's okay." I meant it. I got off the phone and I sat in my studio and I looked at the work on the walls, 12 canvases in various stages, the current series I was building, and I thought, the record is accurate. Whatever happens next, the record is accurate. What happened next was not, as I had half expected, a withdrawal. My parents did not cut contact. They did not send a letter. They called, irregularly, in the months following the profile, with the careful, tentative energy of people navigating newly visible terrain. The calls were uncomfortable and honest in a way our calls had never been before, and the discomfort was the most real thing we had shared in years. And then, in August of 2023, 2 years after the Times profile, Andrea Chu, by then the arts and culture reporter at Channel 7 in Cincinnati, reached out to me. She was doing a feature series on Ohio-born artists who had built national careers, and she wanted to do a segment on me. She wanted to film in my studio, interview me, and do what she called a homecoming element. Filming in Fenwick, the house where I grew up, the garage where I had started. She asked if my parents would be willing to participate. I said I would ask them. I called my mother. Patricia was quiet for a long time after I explained. She said, "You want us to be on television?" I said, "Andrea wants to include the context of where I started. I'm not going to force anything, but I wanted to ask rather than have it happen around you." My mother said she would talk to my father. She called me back 3 days later and said, "We'll do it, if you want us to." I said, "I want the truth on camera, Mom. Not the version where everything was fine, the actual truth." There was a long pause. She said, "I know." She said, "I think it's time." I did not know, when I told Andrea to schedule the Fenwick portion of the shoot for a Thursday in October of 2023, that Andrea would arrive before she was expected. I did not know that my father would open the door in his bathrobe to a camera he hadn't mentally prepared for. I did not know that the unguarded, unprepared moment of my father facing a lens before he had assembled his version of events would produce the most honest footage of the piece. I found out when the stream went live at 9:47 on a Thursday morning, and I watched from Brooklyn, and I saw my father's face in the doorway, and I saw it do the thing it had never done in my presence. It lost its certainty. The Channel 7 feature aired on October 19, 2023 at 7 in the evening Central Time. It ran 11 minutes, long for a local news segment, a testament to Andrea Chu's advocacy for the story within her editorial structure. And it was, by any measure I trust, the most honest document of my life that had ever been made public. Andrea had filmed in my Brooklyn studio for a full day in September. She filmed the canvases and the light and my hands moving over a surface, and she asked me questions in the patient, specific way of a journalist who has done her research and wants the answers on tape. She asked about RISD. She asked about the funding. She asked about the Times profile and the Whitmore Prize and what it had cost to get here. And she asked, directly and without softening the question, whether I had had support from my family in pursuing this path. I told her the truth, the same truth I had told in 2021, with 2 additional years of perspective. I said my parents had told me they were ashamed of me for getting into RISD. I said they had not contributed financially to my education. I said I had worked 2 jobs and applied for every grant available and taken on $43,000 in loans and paid them off from painting sales. I said I loved my parents and believed they loved me. and that those two things had coexisted for years with a significant and damaging failure of support that I had stopped pretending wasn't real. Andrea asked if I wanted them to participate. I said yes. I said I had asked them and they had agreed. The Fenwick filming happened on October 12th. Andrea and her crew drove to Birchwood Lane and spent 4 hours there. They filmed the house, the neighborhood, the garage with the bare concrete floor where the second-hand easel had stood. My father had cleaned out the garage for the occasion, I noticed in the footage. The sawhorses were gone, but the concrete floor still had faint paint marks in a semicircle where my work table had been for 7 years. Nobody mentioned the paint marks on camera. I noticed them. I thought about a girl with $40 of acrylics, and I held it quietly. My parents sat on the couch in the living room for the interview portion. My father had his good sweater on. My mother had her pearl earrings. They were composed in the practiced way of people who had decided to do something difficult and were holding themselves together through the deciding. Andrea asked them about my childhood artistic development. My mother said carefully, "Simone was always drawing and painting, from very early on." Andrea asked whether they had encouraged that. There was a pause. My father said, "We encouraged her to be practical. I thought, that what she was doing was a risk I didn't want her to take." Andrea said, "You told her you were ashamed of her choice to attend RISD." It was not phrased as a question. My father looked at the coffee table. He said, "Yes, I did say that." Andrea waited. He said, "It was wrong. I was wrong to say it." My mother's eyes filled. She said, "We didn't understand what she was building. We were afraid for her. That doesn't make what we said right. It makes it afraid, which isn't the same as right." Andrea asked what they thought now. My father was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I think she's one of the best people I know. I think she built something real from nothing without any help from us, and I think about that a lot, about what she could have built with help." His voice changed slightly on the last sentence, not breaking, but shifting, the way voices shift when they are saying something that costs them. He said, "I wasted a lot of years being wrong about what mattered." My mother said, "I'm proud of her. I should have been proud of her from the beginning. I was afraid, and I let the fear be louder than the love. That's—" She stopped. She said, "That's mine to carry." That was the footage that aired on October 19th. Not dramatically edited, not sensationalized, just two people on a couch in a living room in Fenwick, Ohio, saying true things about what they had done and what it had cost. The camera gave them nowhere to perform. It just held them in the frame and let them be what they were. I watched the segment air from my Brooklyn apartment. I watched it with my friend and studio neighbor, Petra Vasquez, who had known me for 8 years and who sat beside me on the couch with her hand on my arm and did not say anything during the 11 minutes, which was exactly right. When it finished, I sat for a long time. Then I said, "He said he was wrong." Petra said, "I heard." I said, "He's never said that to me directly." Petra said, "He said it to 700,000 people instead." I said, "Yes." We sat with that. The segment was shared widely on social media within the first 12 hours. By the morning of October 20th, it had been picked up by 3 national arts publications and reposted by several large accounts focused on artist stories and family estrangement. By October 22nd, Andrea told me, it had been viewed 2.3 million times across Channel 7's platforms and the shares. The comment section was what you would expect from 2.3 million people encountering a story that resonated. Hundreds of thousands of comments from people who recognized their own kitchens, their own dining room tables, their own parents' voices saying something about shame and practicality and the cost of going your own way. My phone was not something I could manage for approximately a week. I turned off most notifications and let Petra field the messages she could and let the rest accumulate. What I paid attention to were the calls from people I knew, from Gerard Foss, my high school art teacher, who left a voicemail at 7 in the morning on October 20th that began, "Simone, I just watched it and I am sitting here crying in my car in the school parking lot and I need you to know I knew from the beginning. I always knew." and from my grandmother Vivian, who was 86 and in an assisted living facility in Fenwick by then, and who called me on the facility's landline and said in the clear, unhurried voice she had always had, "There it is, my darling. There it is." My father called on October 21st, 2 days after the air date. I answered. He said, "I watched it." I said, "I know." He said, "Simone, I need to say to you directly what I said on camera, because saying it to a camera and saying it to you are not the same thing." I said, "Okay." He said, "I was wrong. About RISD, about the letter, about what I said in the kitchen in 2009. I was afraid, and I let the fear come out as something that sounded like judgment, and it wasn't judgment. It was me not knowing how to watch my daughter want something I didn't understand and couldn't protect her from." He stopped. He said, "I should have tried to understand it instead of diminishing it. I'm sorry, Simone." I held the phone and I let the apology be real, and I let it be insufficient in the specific way that real apologies for 20-year-old wounds are always insufficient, which is not a criticism of the apology, but an honest accounting of what apologies can and cannot do. I said, "Thank you, Dad, I mean that." He said, "I know, I'm going to work on meaning more than that if you'll let me." I said, "I'll let you." My mother called an hour later. Her call was shorter and in some ways harder, because my mother's relationship to articulating difficult things directly was more complicated than my father's, and the effort it cost her was audible in every sentence. She said, "I'm proud of you, Simone. I want to say it without any qualification attached. Just that. I'm proud of you." I said, "Thank you, Mom." She said, "I should have said it years ago." I said, "You're saying it now." She said, "Is that enough?" I was quiet for a moment. I said, "It's a start." The consequences of the segment extended into the professional as well as the personal. Felix Ose at Harrow Gallery called me the week after the air date and said, with the understated delivery of a man who tracked markets for a living, "Your inquiries have increased by about 400% this week. I think we should talk about the next show." The next show, which we began planning in November of 2023, became the most significant of my career to that point. 17 new canvases, a waiting list for the opening, and a review in the Times that landed on the front page of the arts section. 3 pieces entered institutional collections. 2 went to private collectors in the range of $45,000 to $67,000 each. The total sales from the show came to $312,000. I paid off the last of Petra's studio loan that she'd been struggling with for years, because she had been the person beside me on the couch on October 19th with her hand on my arm, and because some debts are not financial, and the financial ones are sometimes the only ones you have the means to address directly. I also set up a scholarship fund, small, $5,000 annually, administered through RISD's Financial Aid Office, for students from rural or small-town backgrounds who are funding their art education without family support. I named it the Vivian Hartwell Scholarship, after my grandmother, who had taken a bus to Providence at 81 in her good coat with a check for $300. She died in February of 2024, 4 months after the segment aired. She died peacefully in the assisted living facility in Fenwick on a Tuesday morning. My mother called me, and I drove to Ohio, and I sat with my parents in the facility's quiet room for the rest of that day. And for the first time in my adult life, I sat in the same room as my parents without managing the distance between us. We were just 3 people who had loved the same woman and were sitting with the loss of her. My father put his arm around my mother. My mother leaned against him. I sat on my father's other side, and after a while he put his other arm around me, and we sat like that for a long time, and it was the most unperformed moment I had ever shared with my parents, and I believe it was the moment the family became something different from what it had been. Not fixed, not reconciled in the clean way of resolved narratives, just different, more honest, more willing to be what it actually was instead of what it was supposed to look like. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than I had hoped for. It is June of 2025 now, 19 months since the Channel 7 segment aired, and my father said he was wrong to a camera, and then said it again directly to me on a phone call the following Saturday, and I want to tell you what the landscape looks like from here. Not the landscape of the story, The confrontations and the camera and the couch in the living room and my grandmother's bus ticket and the scholarship fund named after her. The landscape of the ordinary days that came after all of that. Because the ordinary days are where you actually live, and the ordinary days are what everything was for. I am still in Brooklyn. The apartment on Classen Avenue in Crown Heights that I moved into in 2017 and have been in for 8 years now, with its north-facing windows that give me the particular flat, consistent light that painters spend their whole careers arranging their lives around. The studio is in the second bedroom, which means I wake up every morning in the same building as my work, which is either the best or worst arrangement depending on the day, and which I would not trade for anything more sensible. The walls of the studio are covered in the current series, large canvases, the largest I've worked at yet, each one somewhere between 5 and 7 feet on the longest edge, color moving across them in the way I have been chasing for years and which I am, finally, beginning to catch. Felix Ose and I are planning the next show for the fall of 2026. It will be at a larger gallery than Harrow. Harrow represented me for a decade, and Felix remains one of my closest professional relationships, but my work has outgrown the space in the specific way that sometimes happens between artists and the galleries that launched them, and Felix was the one who said so first, which is one of the reasons I trust him. The new gallery is called Meridian on West 22nd Street in Chelsea, and the director is a woman named Constance Park, who has been doing this for 23 years and who, when I brought her the first photographs of the new canvases in March, said nothing for approximately 40 seconds and then said, "This is the work." 2 words. Adequate. The money situation is, for the first time in my life, genuinely stable. Not wealthy in the way of people who were born into it or stumbled into something scalable. Stable in the hard-earned, carefully managed way of someone who spent years being poor and has not lost the memory of what poor feels like and probably never will. My income from painting sales, licensing, and institutional acquisitions in 2024 was $287,000. My expenses are significantly lower than that because I live carefully. Not from scarcity now, but from habit and from the specific piece of a woman who knows that financial stability is something she built herself and intends to maintain with the same attention she brought to building it. I have a financial advisor named Andrea Chu who I found in 2022 and who I trust the way I trust Felix and Constance and Petra, with the trust reserved for people who have demonstrated over time that they see clearly and act accordingly. Now let me tell you where everyone is, because you've come all this way and the full picture is what you deserve. My father, Robert, is 64 years old and retired from Fenwick Industrial as of January of 2024 after 29 years of keeping the machine running. The retirement was voluntary and came earlier than he'd planned. He'd planned to go to 65, but in the months following the Channel 7 segment and my grandmother's death and the conversations we had been having with increasing honesty, something shifted in him that seemed to reorganize his priorities in ways he hadn't anticipated. He told me in December of 2023, on a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, which was the longest phone call we had ever had, that he had been thinking about what he'd said on the Harrow Gallery website about my 2018 show. He'd looked it up, he said, which I hadn't known, and that reading about the work in the language of people who understood it had made him realize, specifically and belatedly, that he had spent 20 years dismissing something he had never actually looked at. He asked if he could come to New York. He came in March of 2024, 6 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. He came alone. My mother had a prior commitment she couldn't move, which I suspected was also partly her understanding that this particular visit needed to be between my father and me without the buffer of her presence. He took the train from Cincinnati to Penn Station, and I met him on the platform, which felt like the right thing to do, not letting him navigate a city he didn't know alone when I could just be there. I took him to the studio. He stood in the second bedroom of my apartment on Classen Avenue, and he looked at the canvases on the walls and the ones leaning against every available surface and the work in progress on the easel, and he was quiet for a long time. He walked slowly around the room, the way people walk in galleries when they are actually looking rather than performing looking. He stopped in front of a large canvas, 6 feet wide, the colors moving from a deep ochre through terracotta into something almost violet at the far edge. And he stood there for what I estimated was 4 minutes. Then he said, without turning around, "I understand why you couldn't have done anything else." I said, "I know you do." He turned around and his face had something on it that I had never seen in 32 years of being his daughter. Not guilt exactly, which I had seen in flashes since the segment, but something more complete than guilt. Something that was guilt and loss and belated recognition combined. The face of a man understanding not just that he was wrong, but what the wrongness cost. He said, "You were always going to be this, and I tried to stop you." I said, "You tried. It didn't work." He looked at me. He said, "Thank God it didn't work." I said, "Yes." We stood in my studio in the flat north light, and I let the moment be what it was, imperfect and real and 20 years late and worth more than I had expected it would be when I imagined it. We went to dinner afterward at a restaurant near my apartment. We ate pasta and we drank wine and we talked for 2 hours about things we had never talked about his childhood in Dayton, about his father who had been a laborer and who had organized his son's upbringing around the mandate to have security above all else, about the way that mandate had been passed forward to me through decisions my father had made believing he was protecting me. I am not excusing the decisions. Understanding their origin does not erase their impact. But sitting at a table in Brooklyn in March of 2024 with my father and understanding where the fear had come from gave me a piece of information that changed the shape of what I was carrying. Not lighter, more accurate. My father visited New York one more time in October of 2024 to see the works in progress for the 2026 show. He brought my mother that time. Patricia Hartwell in my studio on Classen Avenue was one of the stranger experiences of my adult life. Strange in the specific way of a thing you have imagined in different forms for years finally taking its actual form, which is always both more and less than you imagined. She stood in the second bedroom and she looked at the canvases with an expression I had never seen on her before, which was the expression of someone encountering something they cannot categorize and have decided, finally, not to try. She said, after a long silence, "How do you know what to do next, when you're making one?" I said, "You follow what the painting is telling you." She said, "That sounds terrifying." I said, "It is. It's also the only way." She looked at the canvas on the easel for a long time. She said, "I think I spent my whole life being afraid of exactly that, following something that might not work." I said, "I know." She said, "I took it out on you." I said, "I know that too." She turned to look at me, and her eyes were doing the thing they did, the quiet, surprising tears. And she said, "I am so sorry, Simone, for 2009 and for everything before it." I said, "I hear you, Mom." She said, "Is that enough?" Same question as October of 2023, 14 months later. I said, "It's getting there." She nodded. She looked back at the painting. She said, "It's beautiful. Your work. I should have said that years ago." I said, "You're saying it now." She said, "Yes." We stood in the studio together for another hour, and she asked questions about the paintings. Real questions, curious questions, the questions of someone trying to learn a language they had refused to speak for 30 years. And I answered them, and by the time we left for dinner, I had shown my mother more of my interior world than I had shown her in the previous 32 years combined. Daniel came to the 2018 show opening, which I didn't mention earlier and should have. He showed up without announcing he was coming, and he stood in front of a large canvas for 10 minutes, and then found me across the room and said, "Simone, these are incredible." He said it with the simple, genuine delivery of someone who has no investment in any particular response and is simply reporting what he sees. I said, "Thank you, Daniel." He said, "I've been following your career for years. Did you know that?" I said I hadn't known. He said, "I should have said something sooner. I didn't want to say the wrong thing, so I said nothing, which is also wrong." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "I'm sorry." We had dinner after the opening, the two of us, and it was the beginning of a friendship that has grown steadily in the years since into one of the more surprising and genuine relationships in my adult life. He comes to openings. He follows the work. He calls occasionally with no agenda. He is a good brother, late arriving, making up for lost time with the specific diligence of someone who has taken an honest inventory of what he owes. Petra Vasquez, my studio neighbor and closest friend, is represented by a gallery in Los Angeles now and splitting her time between Brooklyn and Silver Lake. We have Sunday dinners when she is in New York at the Ethiopian restaurant on Washington Avenue that we have been going to since 2016, and these dinners are the most reliably nourishing things in my week. She was there on October 19th, 2023, with her hand on my arm. She came to the hospital with me in February of 2024 when my grandmother was in her final hours. She read the first draft of this story when I was working through how to tell it, and she said, "You're being too generous to your parents in the middle sections." I said, "I'm trying to be accurate." She said, "Accurate and generous aren't the same thing." I thought about that for a long time. I kept the generosity because I decided that accuracy includes the full complexity. And the full complexity includes the fact that my parents loved me in the way they knew how, while failing me in ways they didn't understand. And both those things are true simultaneously, and the simultaneous truth is the accurate thing, not either pole of it alone. Gerald Foss retired from Fenwick High School in 2022 after 31 years in the art department. He lives in Fenwick still, in a house with a garden he tends, with the same focused attention he brought to every student he taught. He and I exchange letters, actual letters on paper, his handwriting looping and his observations about the world as sharp as they were when I was 16 and he was buying me oil paints he called unused stock. He wrote to me after the Channel 7 segment aired and said, "I watched it twice. I cried both times. The paint marks on the garage floor. I saw them." "Did you?" I wrote back, "I saw them." He wrote back, "Good." The Vivian Hartwell Scholarship at RYSD has been awarded 3 times now, 2023, 2024, and 2025. The most recent recipient is a 19-year-old from rural Indiana named Lena Park, who was accepted to RISD's sculpture program and who sent me a handwritten thank you note that arrived in April and that I have pinned above my studio work table where I can see it when I am working. Her note says, in part, "I didn't know people like me got to do this. Thank you for making the path a little wider." I read that and I thought about a bus station in Providence and a woman in her good coat and a check for $300 and a note that said, "I always knew." The path gets wider by people making it wider. One scholarship and one bus ticket and one oil paint set at a time. Now I want to talk directly to you, the specific you who has been reading this because something in it was familiar, because you are the one this story is ultimately for, and I don't want to reach the end without speaking to you clearly. If you are the daughter or the son or the child of any gender who was told, in some version of some kitchen, that your ambition was shameful, I want you to know something that took me 20 years of living to understand fully. The shame was never yours. It was always theirs. The shame your parents expressed about your choices was their relationship with their own unlived life, their own fear, their own need to manage your existence as a reflection of their adequacy. It had the shape of a statement about you. It was always actually about them. This does not mean it didn't hurt you. It hurt you significantly, and the hurt was real, and I am not going to minimize it by telling you it was really about them as though understanding the origin dissolves the impact. It doesn't. The wound is real, regardless of what caused it. But knowing the origin means knowing that the wound was not an accurate assessment. It was a misfire. You were standing in the wrong place when someone discharged their own fear, and the wound is real and the aim was not true. Here is what else I want to say specifically to anyone who is 18 or 20 or 25 and in the middle of doing what I did. Building the thing without support, going around the obstacle, working the facilities job and eating the peanut butter and wearing the same 4 outfits and counting the grant applications. The table at which you are eating your peanut butter is already the beginning of the life you are building. The gap year and the gap year's savings account and the FedEx envelope are already the story. You are already inside the thing you are building, even when it feels like you are only outside the thing you have been denied. Keep going. Keep the receipt for everything. The financial receipts and the emotional ones. The ones that tell you what things cost and what you paid and what it was worth. Keep the taped together letter. Keep the oil paints in the tin. Keep your grandmother's note. Keep the paint marks on the floor. These things are not just memories. They are the evidence that you were real, that your commitment was real, that the thing you were building was real before anyone else could see it. And when the news van shows up, and I mean this literally, but also as the most complete metaphor I have for the moment when the world validates publicly what you have known privately for years, let it in. You don't have to perform grace or manufacture forgiveness or arrive at a resolution that ties up cleanly. You just have to let the record be accurate. You have been telling the truth in your work and your choices and your life for years. Let it be told in the room where the people who doubted you are sitting.